Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Skinwalkers, The Beginning by Rodeo GTM. Note, Dene is the name the Navajo give themselves. To understand the Skinwalkers, first you must know the origins. The Dene creation story describes how in each world there were people, animals, insects, and monsters. In each world something had happened, and they had to leave to the next world. You can Google the creation story and read it for yourself. This information that I am writing was given to me by a Dene elder, knowledgeable in Dene culture, history, and stories. He told me that when the Dene came into this world, the final world, we were at a disadvantage. The other creatures on this world did not care about the Dene. It was the animals that cared enough to make sure the Dene could adapt to this world. The animals talked to the Dene and were amazed about how weak, fragile, and slow the Dene were. It was then when the animals taught the Dene how to harness the animals' abilities. It was meant to be used to help them get through the harsh realities of life. Gaining this ability gave the Dene the ability to travel great distances and become dominant species of this world. The Dene had changed. They were no longer in harmony with this world. The creatures of this world had decided to cut relations with the Dene. Over the years, the Dene had slowly started to lose the ability to harness the animal's ability. There were a few Dene that knew and recognized that they were losing their accumulated knowledge and decided to record them on sandstone cliffs. These records are now recognized as petroglyphs to the unknowing eye, but only a very, very few Dene are capable of deciphering these writings. The creation stories, ceremonies, stories, and history is recorded in sacred sites on the reservation. There was also Dene that started to practice witchcraft and twisted the animals' abilities. They abused their powers and used it for their own personal gain. These individuals knew they needed to save their knowledge and had also scribed their records on sandstone cliffs. Dene witchcraft practitioners despised the Dene culture and did everything opposite. This included building their hogans with doors facing the west and violating everything that was sacred to the Dene. They scribed their teachings on the opposite side of where the Dene elders scribed their teaching. The place where they etched their evil is in a canyon, which is marked with an evil face etched on a rock to the entrance of the canyon. I didn't believe this so. I went to find the location and I came across a face that was etched into a rock. This image gave me chills, and I felt like I was being watched, and I felt scared. I didn't feel safe and felt unwelcome. I didn't even try to enter the canyon. It wasn't worth putting myself in that much danger. I can see the rock when I close my eyes and remember exactly how I felt. I won't go there again. This canyon contains the rituals, curses, ceremonies, and teachings of Dene witchcraft. They have found a way to harness the animals' abilities. My source tells me that the animals gave the Dene abilities without taking a life or doing anything that would disrupt harmony. These witches have defiled, twisted the ancient art of harnessing the animals' abilities. Hardcore witchcraft practitioners have elevated the art of skinwalking, and now only a very few that meet together and form a coven. This coven uses witchcraft to skinwalk, and they are almost unstoppable. Cannot be hurt by conventional means. The single skinwalking practitioner is the weaker of the two. These people harness the abilities of the animals by using its skin. They generally look like a person wearing an animal's hide and are the most commonly seen. The majority of skinwalkers are single practitioners, and it is rare to see a coven skinwalker. Skinwalker That Wanted a Ride by Rodeo GTM. Back when I graduated from high school, I got a job in the oil field. I used to be a parts chaser, and I got parts for the shop and field mechanics. I would often deliver parts to the field and stick around to help the mechanic. Dale had called and requested parts delivered to a remote location near the Navajo Nation border. I got the parts gathered up and took the parts to Dale. It was getting late and I wanted to just drop off the parts and go, but Dale asked me to stick around and we'll leave together. I was just joking around and asked if he was scared. He answered yes, and he told me this story. Dale had turned onto the dirt single-track road to the location. He drove to the compressor site. He had heard all the Skinwalker stories and didn't pay much attention to them. He stayed late on the job. He wanted to get it done so he wouldn't have to come back. When he finished his job, he left the site and drove back on the same road he came in on. While driving down that dirt road, he came across a log that was dragged into the middle of the road. He drove up to the log and got out of his truck and dragged the log out of the way. He was puzzled because it wasn't like that before. He continued to travel on the road until he came to a main highway. He turned onto the highway and started to gain speed, and that's when he noticed the truck swayed. He said it was like a load had shifted, and he felt it. He looked in his rearview mirror and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Then it happened again. This time he turned on his truck bed lights, and that's when he'd seen something in his truck bed. He described it as being the size of a man and having gray fur covering its body. It stood up, and it jumped out of his moving truck at about 70 miles per hour. It ran off to the passenger side of the truck and easily jumped over the fence and continued to run away. Dale said that it had scared him, and he could not sleep for weeks and was afraid of working out in the field when it got dark. I stayed with Dale and we both left together, and we didn't see anything that evening. So quoth this raven. My darlings, I, from Utah, have always been fascinated by Skinwalker stories. I've collected them in the past. Unfortunately, I've lost the collection I've gotten the first-hand accounts. I haven't read Skinwalker stories before because so many of them seemed inauthentic. These that I'm bringing to you today are very authentic feeling to me, and I do believe they are quite true. And so, I hope you enjoy. Skinwalker Stories from the Past. True Stories by Elisha Ninja. This is a story my family told me when I was growing up. We lived in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It was dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and uncle were getting ready for bed. Outside they heard noises, as if someone moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure by the truck. This was immensely out of order because the closest neighbors were miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncle were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong that it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off in the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked towards the light and started to move away, and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran towards the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove. He grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed over the gun and placed an ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired towards the tree. Whatever that thing was, it didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandma chased my aunt inside, and my uncles and grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so my grandfather and uncle chased after the figure. The truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swore that even when the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet. He got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, say their name and it will kill them. Story 2. My cousin lived in the Eastern Agency of the Navajo Nation in a community known as Crown Point. She was still living with her parents at the time and was a good girl. She had good grades, a nice ride, and was a very popular girl that played on the basketball team. When she told us this story, it was very out of the ordinary, and the events that followed would also deepen my belief in the traditional Navajo way and of the taboos associated with the Navajo culture. My cousin was coming home from basketball practice, which ran past sunset. It was during the colder months, and so it was dark by the time she pulled into her neighborhood. She pulled into the small housing community that she lived in. It was far from a fenced community, but there were streetlights, and the neighbors weren't too far from one another. As she neared her home, she saw a group of dogs. This wasn't unlikely, as there are random packs of stray dogs that roam rural communities. These dogs don't belong to anyone, and they get their food where they can. As she got closer, she noticed something was off about the dogs. There were 4 dogs, and they were sitting in a circle, all facing each other. This really didn't faze her until she spoke about the event later, because this was a housing community, and my cousin couldn't barrel down the road so she slowly drove past the group of dogs and kept on going her way. As she continued to drive, she noticed in her peripheral vision that something was running alongside her car. She turned her head to see that a brown dog from the group was trotting alongside her car. She didn't mind much until she hit a strategic placed speed bump. The impact of the bump made her entire car wobble. She looked over at the dog again, still casually keeping pace with the car. She tried to ignore the dog and tried speeding up, keeping in mind where the speed bumps were placed. The dog continued to keep pace. My cousin had to eventually stop at a stop sign. She began to feel immensely uncomfortable and tried to keep her eyes forward, but the curiosity got the best of her. She looked over at the dog. It was facing forward. She continued to stare, and that's when the dog turned its head. Instead of the face of a dog, there was the flat face of a man, covered in hair, and smiling from ear to ear. Fear shot through her body, and my cousin pushed the pedal to the floor, not daring to look back in her rearview mirror. She reached the house and barely pulled herself in the door, weak from fear. My aunt came to her, and my cousin began to sob. She told my aunt everything, and they scheduled a meeting with a medicine man the next day. That night, my cousin was trying to get some rest. She was tossing and turning and felt very ill. She could hear people outside, laughing and talking in Navajo. But she didn't think too much of it because they lived in a community near plenty of neighbors. At the medicine man, he told my cousin that she was very fortunate. The Skinwalker wasn't meant for her. She just happened to spot it while it was out to bring another person misfortune. He also told her that the laughing and talking she had heard in the night was the Skinwalker talking to his friends, letting them know that someone had saw him and that he had scared her. The medicine man told my cousin that if the Skinwalker had been for her, and she had seen him like that, it could have very well killed her. After that encounter, my cousin suffered from many ailments and had to stop playing basketball for a while. She had many ceremonies and eventually got back on her feet. My mother told us a story on the many nights that our electricity went out. When I asked my cousin about it, she confirms it's true, but doesn't like talking about it much. This is part 3. Out on the Navajo reservation, we don't have the city come and collect our trash. So we burn our trash in these huge burning barrels. Not very eco-friendly, I know, but that's what we got. If you don't light the trash properly, the fire will go out and the trash will just sit in the barrel. This is important because we are told to dispose of personal hygiene items correctly. If you remove all your hair from your brush, make sure the trash burned. If it was that time of the month, make sure the trash burned. If you changed a baby's diaper, make sure the trash burned. They tell us these things because skinwalkers have been known to dig through the trash in order to find things that they can use against us. They use the things that we were briefly connected to and bring misfortune on us using these things. Some of my family members take part in the sport of rodeo. So to practice, they have a roping dummy and take turns roping it. My 2 male cousins were enjoying themselves outside, taking turns swinging the rope at the fake calf. The elders are always adamant that we shouldn't stay out past sundown, especially out on the res, where it's pitch black and no one for miles around. But my cousins aren't the superstitious type, and they were under the streetlight. My cousins are joking and laughing, having a great time. That changed when my eldest cousin looks over to the burning barrel. A dark figure is bent over and rummaging through the garbage that failed to burn. My cousins devise a plan that they're going to grab weapons, sticks and rocks, and go chase whatever it is. They move strategically so that they were able to flank the figure. They run full speed at it and begin yelling and swinging their sticks and throwing their rocks. My cousins stated that they kept up with it for the most part. That was until the figure ran under the streetlight. What my cousin thought was a person was actually a goat. Why would they think it was a person? Because the goat was running on its hind legs. They stopped running and fear ran down their backs as the figure ran off into the dark. Feeling nervous and not entirely accepting what they saw, they began roping the dummy again. There was an awkward silence among the boys now. They just saw something unnatural, but talking about it now would just make it seem real. Were they crazy? Did they just see a skinwalker? The boys roped the dummy in silence until one of them looked over to the tree. There was a head peeking out at them. If they didn't pay attention to it, whatever it was would poke its head out from behind the tree and stare. When they would look in the direction of the tree, it would move quickly back out of sight. This was the final straw, and my cousins ran back into the house. They told their parents, and my uncle came out to look. It was still there, poking its head out and going back behind the tree. My uncle loaded his gun and started walking towards the tree. He aimed and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The gun jammed. Whatever it was began to run, but it was so fast, like a blur as my cousins described. When it left, my uncle came in and gave the boys a thorough lecture about staying out late. The next day, my cousins told my uncle that whatever it was had been digging through the trash barrel. They went to investigate, and the creature had pulled a lot of things out of the barrel. What was odd was the tracks. Goat prints were all around the area. They followed a set of tracks, and there they found a baby diaper, several feet from the barrel. Whatever they saw that night had very malevolent intentions. My cousin says that although the sight was ungodly, they know what they saw and stand by their claims. The Navajo Reservation is the largest reservation in the U.S. It goes into New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and Arizona. This story takes place in the northeast region of Arizona, near Indian Wells. It was told by people from around that area. If you're heading west on State Highway 15, out towards Dilkin, you come to a stretch of road that goes into a small valley. I remember going down this road in my youth. If you look at the horizon, it would seem as if the road kept going. Then suddenly your car would be pulled down by gravity as you followed the road. It would always give me butterflies when we'd go down the slope. When I heard the story about this road, it made my stomach feel different. A man was driving home one night, and it was very late. It was a drive that he had done before, so he wasn't too bothered by it. When you're driving on the reservation, sometimes there isn't any way to keep cattle from getting on the road. No fences mean that you need to be extra aware. I was always told to look for the black horse. If you see a black horse, you'll be able to see anything else that may wander into your path of your vehicle. So this man was driving home, not paying much attention. He drives down the slope, but when he gets to the bottom of the valley, he sees it, but doesn't have enough time to react. Suddenly a horse comes out of the darkness. He slams on his brakes, but he is unable to stop and hits the horse with his truck. The impact was not enough to deploy the airbag, but the man was tossed around quite a bit by the incident. He turns on his emergency lights and gets out of the car to assess the damage. The front of the car was crumpled, and one of the headlights was destroyed. He cursed out loud. This was the worst place to have an accident. And he didn't have signal to phone for help. Then he remembered the horse. The man went to the cab of his truck and got a small keychain flashlight. He started shining around looking for the wounded animal. He heard noises, but they didn't sound like a horse. He was positive that what he hit was a horse. As he approached the sound, he could see the animal's fur moving from its ragged breathing. As he got closer, he began to realize what it was. There was a naked, elderly woman wrapped in a large pelt. She was moaning from pain. The man stopped dead in his tracks and got weak from fear. He stumbled back to his truck, and although it suffered plenty of damage, he was able to get it started and drove off. Once he was able to get the signal, he called the authorities. An ambulance drove out there and recovered the woman. She was driven to a local healthcare facility. Due to the fact that many of the healthcare staff were Navajo, no one wanted to touch the woman. The woman was known in the community, and she was thought to be bedridden. This was shocking because she was so far from home, and the state she was in was immensely off-putting. She still had on her attire when she arrived at the hospital. The nurses called her family to come in. When her family got there, they removed her pelt and her jewelry. The staff was very frightened, but there was some non-Navajo staff that was still provided her with care. The elderly woman had only bumps and scrapes. Other than that, she seemed just fine. She was able to get up and walk around that same evening. She went home with her family that night. But after a couple of days, she had passed. In the Navajo culture, if you find out who a skinwalker is, you have the power to destroy them. After the community around Indian Wells found out who, or more fittingly, what this woman was, it was for certain that her time was at an end. So quoth this raven. Well, my darlings, I hope you enjoyed these stories. Like I said before, these truly feel authentic to me. I might bring you some more stories of true stories of skinwalkers if I can find them. I know there are some that I can find in folklore collections around and so forth. Like I say, I'm quite particular about my skinwalker stories, so hopefully Laisha Ninja will share more with us. She's absolutely wonderful. Go visit her stories and give them a point on Reddit, if you will. Please like and share. And if you comment, I will do my best to comment back. If you haven't subscribed, please do so and ring the little bell so you know when to come up and see me. And I will see you next time, my darlings. Sleep well. More true frightening Skinwalker stories. The first three are again by Elijah Ninja. He has done a wonderful job of relaying this wonderful lore and stories for us. The last one by Raldo GTM, and I hope to read more of his as well, as they are equally as authentic and fascinating. True Skinwalker stories by the people who know them best are the best. Part 5. In the traditional Navajo way, skinwalkers are seen as witches, but they weren't always seen that way. My late grandmother, who was a medicine woman that practiced the blessings way, told me of the origins of the skinwalker. Being a skinwalker wasn't always seen as a bad thing. In fact, they were seen as people with amazing gifts. They could change into the form of any animal, run vast distances very quickly, mimic people's voices, and some were known to use magic. During colonization, skinwalkers were used to relay messages between war camps and spy on the enemy without being detected. Having the skinwalker abilities was a gift. When we lost, the good of the community took a back seat and people began to focus on themselves. Instead of sharing what you had, people began to look after their own families, claiming property and livestock, and there were people who got the short end of the stick. Jealousy is a terrible thing. People became jealous of one another and wanted more fortunate people to lose what they had. They looked to skinwalkers who had otherworldly powers to do their bidding. Now, being a skinwalker is not a gift. You condemn yourself to a life of unhappiness and anger. In order to become a skinwalker, you must sacrifice someone that you love very much. This shows that you are indeed committed to depravity. The interesting thing is you could have met a skinwalker and not even know it. They are people like you or me that have chosen a path in which they will hurt others. Navajos want to separate themselves from death of any kind. We burn clothing and personal items of deceased relatives, and it is very taboo to keep anything that belongs to the dead. Keeping such items can make a person sick or suffer horrible events in their life. However, skinwalkers surround themselves with death. Skinwalkers have been known to grave rob and search through people's garbage. They use bones and hair from the dead and victims' personal items to create bundles. They place these bundles near a person's home, and bad luck will fall upon the person. The reason I bring this up, in my upcoming stories, I'll start addressing the bundles and retell skinwalking stories from my immediate family and myself. Again, thank you to everyone that has been reading my stories. And please, if you haven't read my previous stories, take a look. Elijah Ninja. Part 6. My older sister marches to the beat of her own drum, and this story is about her. In her younger days, my sister was very much interested in the rodeo scene. My family actually has a pretty impressive legacy when it comes to the sport. My sisters didn't compete, but had plenty of friends and family that they would go and watch. My two sisters would travel around the Southwest, following the rodeo circuit. The cowboy lifestyle isn't always glamorous. It can be filled with alcoholism, drugs, and depression. Unfortunately, this took hold of my sister, and she got in trouble with the law. My sister was looking at jail time, and the family was very concerned about what might happen to her. This was very out of the ordinary for her. My mother went to a local medicine man, and they talked about next steps. They decided to have a ceremony for my older sister. A few days passed, and it was time for the ceremony. The medicine man and his wife showed up a little past dusk. They came into our house, and we served them the food we had prepared. Everyone chatted for a bit, and when we finished eating and cleaning up, it was time to start. Everyone sat down in the living room in a large circle. The medicine man sat on the far west side of the room. My oldest sister sat to his left. In the middle of the circle was a large pile of sand that was smoothed out on the top. My uncle got hot coals from the fire and placed them on the sand. The medicine man prayed in Navajo and sang blessing songs. This went on into the night. At the height of the ceremony, the medicine man turned to my oldest sister and told her they would have to go outside and pray in the darkness. He told her not to look around as he is singing. He told her to keep her eyes on him. The medicine man, my sister, and my uncle went outside. The medicine man turned around and began singing into the darkness. My sister was watching him sing, trying to keep her focus on only him. Then she heard it. Off in the distance, she heard someone whistle. This made her feel sick to her stomach. Our elders tell us about our culture's taboos starting at a young age. One of the biggest things that they stress is to never whistle at night. They tell us only the dead whistle at night. So when my sister heard whistling out in the darkness, fear gripped her heart. She was so scared that tears began to well up in her eyes. The whistling got louder and louder, as if whatever it was moving closer and closer. My uncle was also outside during the prayer. He admits that he was scared too, but he wanted to be there for my sister. What my uncle saw was even more miraculous. He claims that as the medicine man sang, a bundle came up from above. The eagle feathers that the medicine man was holding opened up like a hand. The bundle gently floated down into the feathers, and the feathers closed around the bundle. The medicine man stopped singing and the group went back into the house. My sister stumbled in, clearly shaken from the experience. The medicine man could see how my sister was. She asked him what was whistling. He told her it was a skinwalker and that he was trying to call the bundle back to it. We gathered around to see what was in the bundle. The medicine man opened up what looked to be a leather pouch. Inside of the pouch was a bone about 1 inch wide and 3 inches long. Upon closer inspection, the bone was hollowed out, and more items were shoved inside the bone, held in place with twigs and dirt. He dissected the bone to find hair and pieces of a shirt, both belonging to my sister, and a very tiny drawing of a woman behind bars. Whatever was calling out to this bundle had very ill intentions for my sister. Fortunately, after the ceremony, all of my sister's charges were dismissed. I asked my sister what they did with the bundle, and she said that she wasn't really sure. She said that she vividly remembers being scared when they were outside singing. My sister controls her emotions very well, so I can't even begin to fathom how scared she must have felt in that moment. Personally, I find it hard to believe that these events are merely coincidental. Part 7. My aunt told me this story. We are related by marriage, so she has a whole new set of Skinwalker stories that I would like to share with you. This story took place when she was a child. My aunt's family lived in a community about 20 miles south of Gallup, New Mexico. The area is far different from where I live. My house is surrounded by desert, and you don't really see trees until you move into the canyon. Bed Springs is a forested area, and where our story takes place. Like many people on the reservation, my aunt's family didn't have running water or electricity. In order to have water, they would have to drive into town and haul water back in large containers. The containers are huge and easily fit in the bed of the truck. Her family would place 2 containers on a long flatbed trailer to make the best of each trip. Her family went into Gallup, filled up the containers, and went around town doing other types of business. Back then, seatbelt laws weren't so strict, so my aunt and her siblings sat in the bed of the truck as they went around town. It began to get dark, and so the family started back home. Most roads weren't paved, and so they had to drive carefully because of the attached trailer. The lights of the town faded away in the distance, and soon the vehicle was shrouded in darkness. They drove, and the kids sat in the back and talked amongst themselves. That was until my aunt noticed something. A figure was crouching by the farthest water container on the flatbed. The truck wasn't barreling down the road, but it was going at a speed that would be impossible for anyone to run and jump on. My aunt nudged her siblings, and they all paused to look at the dark figure. They sat silently and squinted their eyes to look. It was too dark to really make anything out, so they ignored her and continued to talk. My aunt kept her eye on the figure and pulled hard on the sleeve of her brother when the figure began to crawl over one of the water containers. The kids all stopped and watched in horror as the figure began to move carefully over the second container. My aunt said that the figure looked like a person. However, the limbs were abnormally long. Those long limbs pulled its body closer to the kids. At this point, they began to scream and cry. They banged on the window of the truck. At this time, the creature was reaching for the tailgate of the truck. Due to the huge commotion that was now going on in the bed of the truck, the driver slammed on brakes. The creature hit the tailgate and fell down in between the truck and trailer. The driver rolled down the window and asked what was going on. The kids screamed at the driver to go. They weren't sure they were safe until they saw the trailer moving up and down as if it had ran over something large. When my aunt told me this story, I sat in disbelief. She told me that she was uncomfortable when it was crawling on the trailer, but true fear rang through her body when she saw its eyes. I asked her what she meant. She said that they were like teddy bear eyes. I didn't quite understand what that meant until I pressed further. She said that the eyes were shining. When you shine the light in the eyes of an animal, they reflect back. The braking lights were shining, and whatever they saw that night had eyes that glowed back. Memoirs from the Past by Rodeo, GTM. I remember growing up, I used to spend a few weekends at my grandparents' place. They lived on the Navajo Reservation, not too far from the Bistee Wilderness. My grandpa used to have these 3 dogs. He called them his protectors. He used to tell me they were his alarm system, and they would alert him if anything would approach the house. He told me that something would visit them at night, and the dogs would go crazy, bark, and chase something around the house at night. My grandpa had asked me to start digging large holes in the ground so he could bury the dog houses underground. My grandpa said that this would give the dogs an advantage at night. Whatever came at night wouldn't be able to see them until it was too late. Several days went by and it was quiet. Nothing visited the house at night. One moonless night, it was dark, very dark, and I heard the first dog to the north bark. He started to make a growling sound, and it sounded like he was fighting something. I heard the other 2 dogs come running to help the other dog. I heard a yelp, and by then my grandpa was already up and shot his rifle in the air. Whatever came that night had left, and the dogs settled down. The next morning, we found blood and some long hair around the dog's house. And my grandpa found a finger that had a turquoise ring still on it. He believed that his dogs had ripped off the finger of a skinwalker. After my parents heard about the commotion, I couldn't stay much longer and I had to leave. About a week later, the dogs had died. 2 of the dogs had died from their skin being torn from their bodies, and the other was decapitated. My grandparents had to enlist the help of a medicine man to keep the skinwalker away. So quoth this raven. The House on the Hill. True stories related by Rodeo GTM. My grandmother's brother. I really never knew my grandmother's brother. All that I can remember was that he was an eccentric man that lived on the hill. My grandparents lived on the Navajo Reservation, not far from Chaco Wash and close to the Bisti Wilderness. My grandmother's brother used to live about a couple of miles north of my grandparents' place. His house, well, it was more like a shack, was located on the outskirts of the Badlands. When we were little, we were taught to stay away from the Badlands because it was evil. I never questioned them and asked what's so evil about the place. I just accepted the fact that I shouldn't be over there. Growing up, we all didn't go over there. It was forbidden. As time passed, my grandmother's brother had died. It was a strange death. He had died in his house. He would go down to visit my grandparents every so often, but he had not been around in a few days, which was odd. My older uncle went over to my grandmother's brother's house and found that he had died in his house. I say it was a strange death because he had an immediate funeral, and it was done without the family knowing that he had passed. Traditionally speaking, Navajos usually hold a funeral on the 4th day of a person's death. I remember that I had never been over to his house and wanted to see what it looked like on the inside before his house was torn down. My grandmother had requested that the house would be torn down and whatever was left to be burned. I was able to sneak over to the house, and I looked inside. It felt strange in the house. It was a one-room shed-like building. The boards used for the walls were old, faded, and sun-bleached. The boards didn't fit together tightly, and it allowed some sunlight into the room. You could clearly see the sunlight from the dust floating around the room. His bed was small, like a twin-sized frame spring metal bed, with a green wool army blanket covering the mattress. The walls had very few decorations, mostly old shearing tools, knives, and no pictures. There was also an old wood stove and a table that was barely large enough to play cards, and there were 2 crates at the far end of the house. The first crate was wooden, and it housed his clothes. The other was metal, and it had a lock on it. I left the house, and I remember that the house overlooked the Badlands of the West. Beginning construction and the visitor. Several years had passed, and my older uncle had decided to build his dream home on the exact place where my grandmother's brother lived. My grandmother had expressed concern over the build site and pleaded with her son not to build there, but my uncle insisted to build there. The house he designed was a single-story ranch-style house that was going to have all the modern amenities that wasn't available to any reservation home. My uncle had hired a contractor to bring his crew over to start on the construction of the home. They started to clear the land and prep the foundation, and soon started to build the home. While building the house, the contractors brought over their equipment and stored their equipment at the house. My uncle had installed a fence that stretches well beyond the perimeter of the house, and was a barbed wire fence. While the house was being built, the contractors would find their tools missing or move to different areas of the house. The contractors would tell my uncle that they would see shadows inside the house. One morning they found a blood smear inside the wall of the house, and the contractors started to voice their concerns over the events that happened at the house. They had found strange tracks in the sand around the house. Those tracks came from the west, towards the Badlands. My uncle was unfamiliar with the tracks, although he was an avid hunter and well educated in identifying tracks and tracking animals. He was unable to identify the tracks. He enlisted the help of my grandpa, and he came over and examined the tracks. Immediately he left and brought my grandmother to the tracks. At this time, the contractors had all decided to leave because they were afraid of whatever was bothering them at the house. My grandmother already knew what came over to the house. It was a skinwalker. She told my uncle what needed to be done, and he notified the contractors to cease all operations, and they will be back when the problem was resolved. I remember my grandpa raking the ground and getting rid of the tracks, while leaving one set of prints under a 5-gallon bucket. I was curious as to why he left one set, and I asked my grandpa why he left the one set of prints, and he said my grandmother needed it to take care of the problem. Back then I didn't understand why she needed one set of prints, but it wasn't until I was old enough to put the pieces together, and I figured out why she needed the prints. My grandmother had used her traditional medicine to place a curse on the skinwalker. I vaguely remember that she used the tracks to place an injury on that skinwalker so that she could identify who was coming around the house. When she was able to identify the skinwalker by noticing it limp around in their human form, she could confront them and potentially end their skinwalking. I don't know if she was able to identify the person, but events at the house still persisted. Snakes. After a few weeks had passed, the contractors came back to the house, and they continued working on the house. They were still seeing shadows and tools moving around and going missing. It was more of an annoyance. My uncle wanted to have running water in his new house, so he dug an underground water tank, as well as a septic tank for indoor plumbing. He wanted all the conveniences of a modern home. At this time, homes with running water, electricity, and indoor heating and cooling was a luxury on the reservation. As my uncle was burying the underground water tank, he opened the filling lid and looked inside. What he saw scared him to a point that he fell over backwards and screamed. He ran away from the tank, and the contractors came over to see all the commotion. My uncle told the workers that the tank was filled with hundreds of snakes. Snakes were all inside the tank, crawling around. One of the workers went over and looked into the tank. He didn't see anything. Not one snake. My uncle went over and looked back inside of the tank. He didn't see anything but an empty tank. He was distraught and started to become very upset at what happened with his new dream home. He knew all the strange events that happened with his home and started to become more upset and numb over the events. The men kept telling my uncle that they were seeing a shadow moving around the home, and there would be cold spots in the home. My uncle would make excuses and told them they were seeing things, and the insulation was keeping the house cool, so he wouldn't accept that there were paranormal events at the home. The house is done. Several more weeks passed, and the house was finally complete. My cousins had already laid claim to what rooms they wanted, and my uncle had fully furnished the house. Since the house was on the Navajo reservation, and it didn't have electricity, my uncle had installed a generator that ran off diesel fuel, and it had its own building next door. I was excited to see the house complete, and I asked if I could spend the night. My uncle said it was okay for my cousin and I to spend the night. I remember that my uncle's oldest daughter, my cousin, and I were excited, and we had all decided to stay in the living room and watch satellite TV. My uncle had also installed a CB radio in the living room so that we could talk to my grandparents down the hill. I remember we couldn't find anything fun to watch, so we decided to watch some recorded videos on the VCR. I imagined it was around 10 p.m. The generator shut off and the power went out. My cousin said she would go out to the generator and start it back up. My other cousin and I stayed by the door with a flashlight. We watched her walk about 75 feet to the generator house, and I remember it being eerily quiet. I was used to the noise from the generator breaking the silence. The generator came back on, and we all went back inside the house and started up the TV and VCR. I would say it was about 15 to 20 minutes later when the generator went back down. It was pitch black inside of the house again. My cousin grabbed the flashlight, and she told us to stay inside the house, that she would get the generator started again. She went out the door, and this time she closed the door behind her. I got on the CB radio and started to call my grandparents down the hill. I was unsuccessful in calling my grandparents, but we were able to contact truck drivers that were driving on the nearby major highway, Highway 666. The power was restored again. Lights came back on, and the TV had its snowy picture with static gray noise from not having any signal. My cousin came back in, and she looked like something was wrong. I asked her what was wrong. She said the last time the generator went off, the key was turned off. This time the key was turned off again, but she closed the door to the generator house and locked the door behind her. And she said that she found the door unlocked and the generator key turned back off. She got on the CB and called my grandparents again. Still no answer. I remember that she got a reply, but it was from a truck driver on Highway 666. I would say the power stayed on for about 10 minutes, and it turned back off again. My cousin made sure that the doors were locked, and she went into her dad's room and grabbed a rifle. At this time, my other cousin and I were scared. We didn't know what was out there and why it was bothering us. We just wanted it all to stop. I wanted to head back to my grandparents' house. My other cousin had suggested that we all take flashlight and rifle and walk the 2 miles to my grandparents' house. My older cousin said that we should stay hunkered down in the house and wait until morning to head to our grandparents' house. We were hearing scratches on the door and tapping on the windows, and at other times we heard someone or something walking on the roof of the house. I asked my older cousin if we should lock ourselves in the bathroom, and that's when we heard my grandpa's voice blasting over the CB speakers. It scared the living crap out of us, and we were so glad to hear his voice. My older cousin told my grandpa what had happened, and he said for us to stay in the bathroom and lock the door. He said to listen for his truck, and he'll honk the horn 3 times. That's when he told us to come out and get in the truck. It was the longest 10 minutes of my life. It sounded like whatever was outside knew we were in the bathroom. It was making thumping sounds right over our heads. Then we heard it move away like it ran away. That's when I heard the most wonderful sound. A rumbling V8 engine. I knew that my grandpa was here. We listened for the honk, but all we heard was the truck's idling motor. We wondered what was taking so long. We wondered if everything was okay. Even questioned if we should go outside and check on our grandpa. Finally, we heard the 3 honks from my grandpa. We raced out of the bathroom and ran outside. My grandpa was standing in front of the truck, with its headlights on and holding a rifle. He was telling us to hurry up and get in. We ran as fast as we could and jumped into the cab of the truck, finally feeling relieved. And we asked what took so long for him to call us out. My grandpa didn't say why he took so long, but he said that we shouldn't stay in that house alone anymore. When we got back to my grandparents' house, he told us to go straight to bed. As we lie quietly in our beds, I tried to listen to my grandpa's conversation. I remember holding my breath so that I could be as quiet as possible, concentrating on what they were saying. In Navajo, my grandpa said he knew it was a terrible idea and that we shouldn't have stayed up there alone. He also said that a Yi-nal Gloshi was up there again, and he said it was on the house when he pulled up. He said that once he drove up there, it ran and jumped off the roof. My grandpa said out loud to the Skinwalker that he'd taken bitter root and put ash on his rifle so that he would shoot the Skinwalker if it continued to harass his family. I heard my grandma ask if it was the Skinwalker with the long ears, and my grandpa replied yes. I don't know how many Skinwalkers were in the area, but I know they used to come around every now and then. I remember how heavy my grandma's quilt felt, and it was comforting, like being held and put to sleep. We slept the rest of the night without being in fear of what was out there. Don't sleep outside. One evening, my older uncle and his family were on their way back from town. My uncle had 2 daughters, and the youngest daughter was upset that she didn't get to buy a particular toy while they were in town. She was crying and throwing a fit about not getting her way. When the family arrived at the house, my uncle, his wife, and the older daughter went inside. My younger cousin didn't want to go inside and was still crying about not getting her way. She said she would rather spend the night in the truck. My uncle said that it was her choice and that she could stay outside and cry her eyes out. She could come inside when she was ready. The family went inside the house, and my younger cousin lied down across the bench of the truck. It wasn't too long before she fell asleep. She said that she remembered seeing all the stars from the windshield of the truck. My cousin said she was awakened by a sudden movement of the truck. It swayed as if something was in the truck bed. She sat up in the truck, and she thought that it was probably her dad trying to scare her. Whatever was in the truck bed climbed onto the roof of the truck. That's when it peeked into the cab of the truck from the top of the cab. It looked through the top of the windshield. My cousin described a creature that was pale, and it had very dark eyes. She said it had large black eyes, and it was grayish-white. It had tiny nostrils and a tiny mouth. It looked at her and she screamed as loud as she could. She honked the horn and it finally moved back over the cab. She could still hear it move around as she continued to honk the horn. My uncle had finally come outside to see what the commotion was about. She told him what she saw, and my uncle took a look around while my cousin ran back inside the house. Her mother had to console her because she was hysterical and crying uncontrollably. My uncle didn't find whatever terrorized my cousin, and she would never go outside alone in the dark. Missing baby. All previous events that have happened in the house have been written off as vivid imagination, and still small events would happen. Shadows will still appear every now and then, and things would go missing and reappear somewhere else. At times the water would turn on, and my older uncle would get mad because he would have to haul more water for the tank. I remember that my uncle would blame his girls that they would leave all the kitchen cabinets open, even though they didn't do it. My uncle accused them of trying to scare everyone, and they would try to make the house look haunted just so they could move back to town. My aunt had visited the house several times, and she did not have any experiences, so she believed that everything about the house was made up. My aunt had asked for my grandma to babysit her daughter while she went to an appointment that day. She had requested to have her daughter stay at my uncle's house just because it had running hot water available, and she felt it would be more convenient to care for her there. My grandma was weaving a rug, so she insisted that my aunt move her loom to the house so that she could continue to weave her rug. After the loom was set up and my grandma and her granddaughter were settled in the house, my aunt left for her appointment. My grandma tuned her AM radio to KNDN, a local Navajo radio station, and began weaving her rug and listening to her granddaughter make cooing noises in her car seat. She was making progress on her rug, hoping to have it finished before the rug auction at Crown Point in a few weeks. My grandma said that she heard a truck pull up and honk its horn 3 times. My grandma was puzzled and wasn't expecting any visitors that day. She sat quietly and the truck honked 3 more times, and my grandmother got up to take a look outside. She looked out the window, opening the curtains, and she didn't see any vehicles. She heard the horn honk 3 more times. This time she said it sounded like it was coming from the north side of the house. My grandma worried that someone might be driving around the house trying to steal something from my uncle's house. My grandma goes outside and walks to the north side of the house and doesn't see anything there. She then walks to the west and back to the south, walks the perimeter of the house and does not see one sign of a truck. She walks back inside the house and sits down in front of her loom and begins to weave her rug. She notices that she doesn't hear her granddaughter making noises. She turns to look at the car seat. The baby is gone. My grandma panics and frantically looks for the baby in the living room. She wonders if that truck was just a distraction and someone might have come into the house while she was out looking around the house. My grandma said that she was crying hysterically and screaming out the baby's name, hoping to hear the baby crying. She looks at the ground for any tracks that would indicate that someone else was in the house. No tracks were found. She then begins looking in the house, crying and asking for the child to be returned, almost like she was pleading with the house to return her grandchild. She said she dropped to her knees and cries. Then she hears a faint cry coming from the back bedroom. She quickly gets up and runs to the back bedroom, which was the master bedroom, and listens for the crying. She hears the baby crying from the closet. She opens the door and sees the child lying on the floor. My grandma picks up the baby and holds her close to her chest, while quickly leaving the house. She walked the 2 miles back to her own home while still crying and clutching the baby all the way home. After several hours, my aunt returns to the house and doesn't see anyone there. She's puzzled and was concerned that the car seat is still there and the radio is on. She wonders what happened and why her mom and daughter wasn't there, especially leaving the house the way they did. She drives towards my grandparents' house. She notices there were footprints in the road that led to her parents' house. When she arrives at her parents' house, she finds her mother still holding the baby and whimpering as if she'd been crying for some time. My grandmother begins telling her about what happened to them while they were at the house, and vows to confront whatever's there that took her granddaughter. The Vortex. My grandmother had already made up her mind she wasn't going to allow what was in that house to harm her family. She had vowed to confront what was there and expel it from the house. My grandma was very traditional and practiced native medicine. She was a crystal gazer, where she used sacred crystals to find ailments and locate people while looking into her crystals. She also practiced hand trembling, which was also used to find ailments and a diagnostician of ailments. I've heard on a few occasions that she used to locate missing people and find circumstances of a person's death. She also had knowledge of the evil way, the dark practice of witchcraft in native medicine. My grandma had acquired a few sacred items and sought help from another medicine man. They both went into the house and began a ceremony to expel whatever was in the house. They went into each room, blessing the room with sage and sealing the room with ash. When they finally went to the master bedroom, the medicine man started to vomit fiercely and bleeding from the nose. My grandmother said that she felt a nauseous feeling and felt dizzy, almost fainting. They both retreated from the room and closed the door, sealing it with ash. The medicine man said that the room was the source of the evil, and it was attracting evil spirits, including skinwalkers. The medicine man said that he would try to pinpoint where the evil is coming from, but that he would need to go in alone. He began to light a medicine bundle, take bitter root, and mark his forehead with ash and enter the room. He said the room was very cold and that he feels the presence of numerous entities in the closet. He opens the closet and sees a black mass on the floor, swirling like the eye of a black hurricane. He begins the ceremony to close the portal, but was met with resistance. The medicine man hears a voice from the swirling mass. It tells him that he cannot close the portal, and that only the one who summoned the evil could close the portal. The medicine man continued the ceremony, and the mass started to diminish and eventually disappears. He blesses the room with sage and corn pollen. He attaches a burnt log to the top of the interior of the closet and seals the door with ash. He tells my grandma that whatever was summoned was evil and is too strong to keep under control, and that it will build enough strength to break free again. It wasn't going to be kept bound and sealed forever, that it would eventually break free, and that he recommends that my uncle abandon the house. It was cold. I have another aunt that had some skepticism about the events that happened at that house. My uncle had moved out of the house and moved back into town, leaving the house vacant. My aunt, her boyfriend, and their 3-year-old son moved into the house. She felt that it was a perfectly good house and that it would save them money if they would move in and save on rent payments. The first few days were uneventful. They all slept in the living room together because the rest of the rooms were being used for storage. One evening they went to bed, and all fell asleep. My aunt and her son slept on the bed, and her boyfriend slept on the floor next to the bed. That night, my aunt heard some footsteps walking down the hall. She said it sounded like bare feet on a concrete floor coming down the hall. She had thought it was her boyfriend that was walking down the hall. The footsteps walked from down the hall and into the living room and to the area where they were sleeping. She felt someone sit on the edge of the bed. Whatever came down the hall had lifted the covers to the bed and crawled into bed with my aunt and her son, its body leaning against my aunt. And she said out loud, "Boy, you're cold." Almost immediately, whatever crawled into bed quickly got out of bed, threw off the covers, and stepped on the boyfriend's neck. My aunt's boyfriend started choking and gasping for air. Whatever it was ran through the living room and down the hall. My aunt got up and turned on the lights and started to panic. Her boyfriend was still trying to compose himself, asked why my aunt had tried to choke him. She began to tell him what happened, and the boyfriend was too hesitant to go after whatever ran down the hall. He suggested to investigate when they have more light. They decided to leave as quickly as they could. They didn't even bother packing their belongings. The next morning, my grandpa went up to retrieve my aunt's belongings, while my aunt and her family waited in the truck. They haven't returned to that house ever since. The entity appears. After my aunt and her family had experiences at the house, they were afraid of going back, and they recommended that no one should live there. However, my younger uncle Max and his best friend Leo decided they wanted to see what was actually going on in the house. Max didn't have any experiences at the house, and he was skeptical about what was going on. So he invited his best friend over to spend the night. I remember that night the power was going in and out the house, and my older uncle had mentioned to them to pack and plenty of firewood because it was going to be a cold night, and that my uncle did not refill the propane. He didn't want to buy propane because no one was living at the house. Max had started a fire in the fireplace, and he and Leo were going to sleep in the front room. That night they turned in early and went to sleep since they didn't bring anything to entertain themselves. My uncle was sleeping closest to the front door, and his best friend was sleeping on the couch across the room. It was quiet, and my uncle said he had heard some noises. It sounded like someone was rummaging through the back rooms, and that's when Max heard some footsteps coming down from the hall. The footsteps sounded like a smaller person, or maybe a child. Max said that he was in bed and lied very still, with the blanket pulled over his head. He had left a small opening to see out from under the blankets. Max described a little girl coming in from the hallway. It walked into the room, and it was beside Leo. He said that the little girl was dressed in a long white gown. She had long black hair and was barefoot. The girl walked towards the fireplace, and Max said that her clothing reminded him of the clothes that a girl would wear at a boarding school. Max said that he couldn't see her face while she was walking over to the fireplace. The girl outstretched her hands up to the fire, as if she wanted to warm herself by the fire. She looked over her shoulder towards my uncle, but it didn't seem like she was looking directly at him, but more towards the door. My uncle said that he heard the doorknob turning as if someone was trying to open the door. He distinctively remembers locking the door, making sure that no one would enter the house without them knowing. The little girl quickly turns away and runs back down the hall. and almost the same time, the front door opens up. Max said that he felt a blast of cold air, and whatever walked in looked towards Leo. My uncle said that Leo lied motionless, and he had pulled the covers over his face, with his eyes exposed. Max described that the entity came inside the door, had very long hair, and body was covered in some type of white paint, and it had on a primitive type loincloth. It also was wearing jewelry, which was mostly turquoise and a bit silver around its neck. It also wore a belt made of silver, and it had buckskin pouch attached to a sling over its shoulder. It walked between him and his best friend, and his best friend was laying on the couch, motionless and quiet. It walked inside the house and went over to the fireplace. It stared into the fire. My uncle said that he tried to whisper to his friend, but he couldn't talk. He said that he tried to move, but he couldn't move either. The entity stood there, and every once in a while it looked at Leo. Then it looked towards the hallway. Max said that he made an effort to move and even tried to yell, yet he only let out a moan. The entity turned towards my uncle as if to acknowledge that my uncle was aware of its presence. Max said he got a good look at it, and it didn't have a face. He described that where the face should have been was filled with darkness. It proceeded to walk towards the front door, and it went outside. The door closed behind it as it left. Max and Leo were finally freed from their catatonic state, and they lit their lanterns, and my uncle asked Leo why he didn't do anything. Leo said that he couldn't move or speak. He said that he'd seen the little girl, and she was pale and had black eyes, solid black eyes. Max said that they had stayed awake the rest of the night and kept the fire burning. They even tried to seal the front door with ash and prayed for protection. That morning, the two men left the house and went back to my grandpa's house, where my grandparents scolded them for staying the night in that house. Welcome. Please come in. A few months had gone by and the house was vacant. The house was used mostly for storage. My grandmother had stored some of her weaving tools in the living room of the house. She had asked me to go up to the house and retrieve her weaving tools. I didn't want to go up to the house, nor did I want to go inside that house. I saddled up the horse because I didn't want to walk up the hill, and the road was too sandy. The horse, which they named Ruth, was an older horse and very gentle. We rode together up the hill, and we approached the gate. I got off the horse and unlocked the gate. As I walked back to Ruth, I noticed that her attention was towards the house. Her ears were fixated towards the house, and she stared at the house. I pulled her bridle and tried to lead her towards the house. She became skittish and pulled back. Her behavior was out of the ordinary. She threw her head back and almost stood up on her hind legs. She wasn't going any further. I walked her back to the gate and tied her up to the gate. I started to walk towards the back door of the house. My hands were fumbling around in my pocket, trying to find the single key that opens the back door. When I got to the door and had the key in my hand, the doorknob turns, and the door opens up. I jumped back away from the door. I knew no one should be there. Retelling this story puts chills down my spine. I turned away and ran back away from the house. I was probably 30 yards away from the house and looked back. The door was open, and I seen a shadowy outline of a figure standing in the middle of the hall. The door closed, and I didn't want anything more to do with that house. I quickly went back to the horse and closed the gate. I think Ruth knew that we needed to get away fast, because I didn't have to kick her to run. She just bolted back towards my grandparents' house. Christmas lights. Several months have passed, and the house stood alone on the hill, abandoned and unattended. Every so often, when we looked towards the house at night, we would see lights on at the house. My uncle had contracted the utility company to remove the electricity and cancel the propane refills. Even though there was no power at the house, the lights would still come on. People would often drive by and see the lights on at night. They would ask my grandparents when my uncle moved back to the house. My grandparents didn't want to tell others about the house and would tell other people that my uncle stayed there once in a while. One evening, my aunt and her husband spent the night at my grandparents' house to house sit while my grandparents were away. She told me that she was outside in the evening and she seen some strange lights over my uncle's house. She described it as Christmas lights twinkling all over the house. All sorts of colors, twinkling. She was puzzled about what she'd seen, and she told her husband about it. He went outside, and he seen the lights. He went back inside and picked up a flashlight. She asked him what he was going to do with the flashlight. He said he was going to signal the lights. She told him that wasn't a good idea, but he went outside with the flashlight. He shined the flashlight towards the lights, and the lights turned off. The lights turned into a green light beam that surrounded my uncle's house. The green pillar of light started to move towards my grandparents' house. My aunt said it started to move towards their direction pretty quick, and they both ran inside the house, locking the doors and closing the curtains of the house. She says that they ran into the bedroom, and that's when the entire house was covered by green light. They crawled under the bed and laid there quietly. She said that it was an eerie feeling and that she felt static charge around them. My aunt said that the green light shut off after a few moments and everything went dark. The power was off and it was pitch black in the house. They waited several more minutes and her husband crawled out from the bed and looked out the window. He said that it was gone. My aunt and her husband went outside and they seen the lights going towards the east. This time they didn't try to signal the lights while it was leaving. Abandoned. The house sits alone and undisturbed and weathering away. The shingles on the roof have patches of bare spots from the wind blowing off shingles. The brown paint used to paint the trim have peeled off and the stucco on the walls are cracked. The house is still holding itself together, and the vegetation around the house is overgrown. I believe that the house still holds items for storage, and the owners of the items will not go back there to claim their belongings. I know my grandmother still has some of her things in that house, but she has passed away, and those things will stay there. My youngest uncle has also passed away, and grandfather too. They all have items that were inside that house. My relatives speculated that if someone left personal belongings in that house, that person would be cursed. I really don't know what to believe about that house. All I know is that house is evil, and it has something in there that enjoys to torment people. My uncle won't tear down that house, and he said that time will eventually take its toll on the house. As it sits today, the curtains are still up, and every once in a while, when you drive by that house, the curtains will draw open, as if someone is there trying to look out the window. So quoth this raven. And a very big 2 Skinwalker Stories by Ashki90. Driving late at night. This story happened to my sister, who is a traveling registered nurse. Her occupation takes her all over the Navajo reservation. So most times her husband, when he's available, will drive her from and to her next shift. She worked the night shift mostly. They've never shared a ghost story before this or since. It was between 2:45 and 3 a.m. in the summertime. If you're from the res, you know that most nights are arid, with a slight cool breeze. Well, she had finished her shift in Tuba City sometime around midnight, and her husband was driving. Her next job was in Chinle, Arizona, so they decided to go through Coyote. They were driving on that stretch of desolate highway between Round Rock and Lukachukai. The streetlights from the homes are scattered in the horizon miles apart, and most times it's just pitch black. She was half asleep, but alert because of all the caffeine in her system, and the fact that she is used to being awake all night because of her job. They had not seen another vehicle for an hour or so, and were not familiar with the area, having only driven through the area a few times. She said they were driving on the road, and in front of them, probably about a football field's length, she noticed something splattered across the 2-lane highway. She said it was dark. Roadkill or dead livestock on the road is a common thing on the reservation due to poor fencing and highway maintenance. She figured it looked familiar, but not out of place as they got closer. She said she remembered the shimmer of the dark matter, like wet pavement. She thought to herself, it must be recent blood splatter if it's still wet. Her eyes began darting across the landscape and trying to assess the damage, looking for the animal carcass. The blood puddle spanned the width of the entire highway. She thought it had to have been from a large animal like a cow or horse, but she couldn't locate the large bloated carcass of any livestock. Something didn't feel right. As rural as the location was, and how recent the seemingly wet blood was, she figured no one could have been there that quickly to dispose of the roadkill. As soon as she came to this conclusion in her head, she said her instincts took over. She felt like someone kicked her in the stomach, like the ground falling out beneath you, or the way you feel dropping on a roller coaster, but no joyous emotion. It felt bad or evil. She jolted upright and began to scan the dark horizon for any clues. Her husband later said he didn't want to scare her, but came to the same conclusion silently to himself. She said the blood froze and her heart skipped a beat when she made out a silhouette, slowly rising on the left shoulder of the highway. Her mind began to race with what it could possibly be. We haven't passed any vehicles in a long time, and we are far from the nearest residence. What could be out in the middle of nowhere, this late and this isolated? It was standing upright and facing the opposite direction. Her husband begins to speed up as they near it. She doesn't want to look because everything about this situation seems wrong, and she doesn't want to see something she can't unsee. Too late, it is in her peripheral, and she doesn't want to close her eyes because she said that would be more terrifying. Her eyes stay straight ahead, but her curiosity gets the best of her, and her eyes wander off to the left. As the headlights hit the silhouette, almost full on, she said it looked like a person standing there, wrapped in a white sheet. a white sheet that had been splattered with blood. The figure stands completely stoic, not flinching or shuddering from the lights of the vehicle. The figure seems to have shoulder-length black hair that looks jaggedly cut. She said the way the hair hung off the head of the figure, it looked matted or greasy and not free-flowing or clean. They are passing the figure, her husband trying to stay on the pavement, but the furthest away from the left shoulder of the road will allow. She can't make out the face because the figure has its head bowed down and the hands out in front of it in a prayer stance. Neither of them speak. Her mind is rushing with the thoughts, like what if the vehicle stopped working, or what if whatever it was started chasing us? Who would be able to help us? They made it to the next intersection towards many farms. A sigh of relief. That's one of the reasons Navajo elders tell you never to drive after dark or really late. Something wicked this way comes. This story recollects what happened during the Navajo Nation fair season, 2015. My roommate and her boyfriend decided to head back to the reservation to take part in the festivities, rodeo, parade, and carnival. My roommate was the offspring of divorced parents and spent her teenage years half on the reservation in Window Rock, Arizona, with her mother, and half with her father in Phoenix. She was raised as a devout Catholic, even attending Catholic school. Nothing paranormal had ever occurred to her in her lifetime, up until this point. Her boyfriend was an urban Navajo who was Christian, having been born and raised off the reservation in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm declaring their religious ideologies and affiliations because neither of them believed in Navajo traditionalism or ghost stories. Late one evening, after both of them got off work, they decided to head out to make the most of the 3-day fair weekend. My roommate had made prior accommodations with a good friend from high school. When my roommate was a young adult, her mother decided to move away from the res. If her mother had still lived in Window Rock, she would have simply stayed there. The accommodations were as follows. Her good friend opted to stay at a close relative's and offer her 2-bedroom, 2-bath manufacture home at their disposal. The trailer was located off the road between St. Michael's and the first 4-way intersection. The first intersection past KTNN when you are heading towards Window Rock from Summit. Many have called it the back road to St. Michael's. The old original township of St. Michael's, that is. As you can imagine, they arrived to their Navajo Fair B&B pretty late. The trailer was off to the right of the main highway and was situated at the foot of a large rolling hill. There was no street light. First order of business. My roommate calls her friend to let her know that they arrived safely. They walk up to the trailer and unlock the door and give themselves a tour of their accommodations. They turn on all the lights in every single room as they toured. My roommate had driven the entirety of the journey home, so she was a bit more fatigued than her partner. She asked him to go get the luggage from the car. It was a hatchback. The car was parked about 40 feet away. She explained to me that it had rained some weeks before, and the dirt road leading up to the house was wrecked. To avoid bottoming out, she had parked on level ground. She walks into the guest room, and her boyfriend is already laid out on the bed. She pleads with him to go get the luggage, and most importantly, her makeup bag, so she can remove her makeup before bed. She compromises with him and that she'll go out with him if he does the heavy lifting. She doesn't want to put her heels back on, so she decides to watch him from the porch. Yes, heels. She works at a bank and had to always dress professionally, in a pantsuit and heels. So as she's standing on the top stair of the small 3-stair porch, with the front door slightly ajar, her hand on the doorknob, her boyfriend walks off into the pitch black. The light from his cell phone serves as the only beacon of light, signaling his location. As she watches his light grow dimmer and smaller in the distance, she hears what seems to be a pack of dogs howling and barking. She said it sounded like a rumble. A pack of feral res dogs or coyotes fighting. The pack of dogs come barreling down the large hill behind the trailer. She hears a loud thud against the back wall of the trailer. The thud was so loud she heard the rattling of the picture frames that were hanging. At this point, fear begins to creep into her mind. She calls out for her boyfriend and hears no response. She shouts for him once again. That's when she realizes the dogs have all gone silent. All at once, in a fluid succession of motions, she said that something from inside the trailer slams the front door so fast that it creates a gust of wind. She said that if she hadn't been holding on to the doorknob, it would have knocked her off the landing of the front steps. The front porch light flickers and goes dead. She's standing there barefoot in the darkness. She tries to open the door and retreat back into the trailer. She was unable to turn the doorknob until it clicked. The door wasn't locked. Something heavy was pressed up against the flimsy manufactured hollow core door from the inside. At this point, she said she didn't realize she was crying at the brink of an anxiety attack. Adrenaline took over, and she began to throw herself and all her weight against the door. She said once she saw it inch open and the light from inside flood the doorway for a split second before it slammed shut in retaliation. Fight or flight. She decides to run barefoot into the darkness to find her boyfriend. His account. He leaves his girlfriend at the top of the front door steps as he walks off into the dark, with only his phone serving as flashlight. He is being very careful where he steps because the earth is turned up and twisted and gnarled. Deep ruts and grooves from a vehicle driving in the mud before it hardens into a crust. He's afraid he might twist his ankle. He, too, hears the frenzied howling and barks from the dogs. He turns around to look at where the sounds are coming from. In the distance, he sees the faint light of the porch light go off. He rationalizes to himself that the dog's barking frightened his girlfriend, and in fear she ran inside and unintentionally turned the porch light off. He continues walking in the direction of the car. He hears the thud of heavy footsteps behind him, mimicking his own stride, not exactly in tune with his, following a split second after his own thud, almost echoing his own intentionally. Figuring it might be his frightened girlfriend running out to find him, he calls out for her, to no avail. He sees a dim flicker in the distance, the light from his phone bouncing off the reflection of the tail light of the car. His body floods with relief. Relief quickly drains to despair. His phone erratically dies. His heartbeat almost beats out of his chest. How could this be? He wasn't on his phone the entire drive back. It was fully charged. He takes a few urgent paces towards where the car was before the lights turned off. His palms are sweaty, and he swears he could feel his heartbeat pounding in his hands. He desperately reaches into his pockets for the car keys. He begins frantically pressing all the buttons, the lock, the unlock, panic, and open hatchback buttons. Nothing. He even stretches out his hand in the dark as he presses the buttons, thinking he's on the cusp of the electronic radius of the vehicle to respond. Still nothing. The footsteps behind him hastened and almost sounded like he was going to be charged from the back. He's too terrified to look back. At this point, he realizes the dread he feels in the pit of his stomach means something unnatural. His shoulders drop as if he instinctually braces for some sort of impact. The sound of heavy footsteps would indicate that he should have been hit by now. Nothing. The footsteps loudly lead directly up to him, to his heels, and nothing. He opens his eyes. He hears something like a coin drop and hit the top of the car. He turns around to the patter of bare feet on the dirt road. His girlfriend charges into a full embrace, hugging him and burying her face into his chest. Mind you, his feet stay planted. He doesn't take one step forward or back. The car keys are still in his hands. His thumb presses down. A loud click. The familiar sound of the hatchback automatically opening, and the light from inside the car quickly floods their immediate surroundings. They grab their luggage and a pair of flip-flops from the car and slowly make their way back to the trailer. Oddly, the porch light is on now. My roommate makes her boyfriend go inside and check all the rooms before she goes back in. He opens the door with ease. He checks each room meticulously. There's no one inside. All the windows are still locked from the inside. I've never retold this account to anyone, but I thought I would finally share it before time and life erase all the details from my memory. Once in the safety of the trailer, her boyfriend pulled out his cell phone, and it turned on to the same battery percentage. They corroborated their experiences to recount what happened to each. Both of them are dumbfounded at the fact that both of them were shouting at the top of their lungs for the other one at one time or another, but neither of them said they heard the others yell. Growing up on the res, you hear your fair share of Skinwalker and ghost stories, but this was the first time I heard one where the perpetrator manipulated electronics to a great extent, or even at all. This was also the first case where the perpetrator manipulated sound waves. Both of them swore that they were easily in earshot of each other, but weren't allowed to hear the other's cries. There was no structures or trees between them. Collecting the sound waves, he heard the pack of dogs, but wasn't allowed to hear her screaming out for him. What also spurred me to share this was the massive amount of questioning from some Reddit users. If they exist, why haven't they been filmed or caught on camera? Skinwalkers are just as modern as you and me. Wicked as much as they may be, they're not stupid, and deal with smartphones and technological advances as much as anyone. They walk the world as normal people during the day. So quoth this raven. I'd like to thank my Patreon supporters, Ermin Case, Darren and Jennifer Daw, and Callist Enoch. And thank you, all my darlings. I love you all so much and appreciate you listening to my little stories. If you like this, please hit the little button to let me know. If you didn't, hit the little button to let me know. Leave a comment. I'm always glad to talk with you, my darlings. I'm open to suggestions and criticisms, critiques. If you have not subscribed, please do so and ring the little bell so you know when to come up and see me. And I will talk to you next time, my darlings. Farewell. My darlings, I bring you another Skinwalker story from Rodeo GTM. I hope you enjoy. Ceremonial Visitor. I'm sharing an event that happened back in the early 1990s. It was a story that a close friend and I experienced. I've changed their names to keep their identities hidden. I grew up in a reservation border town. For those who don't know what that is, it's a town that is adjacent to the reservation. These towns are frequently visited by natives who live in close proximity to town. Like most reservation border towns, the relationship between natives and non-natives can be intense. Our neighborhood was mixed racial, and we all looked out for one another. I had a longtime friend that I grew up with, Leland, and his older sister, Tina. Their mother was Navajo, and through the Navajo clan system, she was my aunt. Their father was Mexican. He worked in the local oil field industry, as did my father. Leland and I were best friends. We had sleepovers, and we both attended each other's family events. We were like brothers, and Tina was also like a big sister, too. Leland and I attended the same high school. We were both sophomores, and Tina was a senior at the same high school. Tina was popular and had a huge social network at school. Leland and I were just a couple of nobodies. Guys used to come over and try and ask her out, even at their house. Life was good in the neighborhood. That was about to change. Prom was nearing, and Leland and I had no intention of going. Tina, on the other hand, had several guys asking her to the prom. I remember catching a few conversations from Tina and her mother about who she was going to prom with. I overheard Tina saying there was a native guy that asked her to prom, and that she had declined his offer. She said that he had gotten upset and started to insult her over her racial bigotry, and that she only dated white guys. I didn't see that particular altercation, but I did overhear their conversation. I think this was about the time when things started to change. Leland and Tina's family started to experience a series of bad luck. At first, it seemed like they were just inconveniences, but it soon snowballed to more and more events. Their family started to have vehicle breakdowns, and arguments with others seemed to escalate. I remember that their father was laid off, and the mother had to look for work to help pay the bills. She'd gotten a job as a night janitor and would come home in the early morning hours. At first, their father would make rude comments about her coming home late and that she was having an affair. Things at that house were becoming more and more heated, and I didn't want to go visit Leland anymore. I would ask for him to come over to our house instead of visiting at his house. Leland would often ask to stay at our house because he didn't want to listen to his parents fighting, and his sister would just lock herself in her room. One morning, when Leland's mom was coming home, she'd seen a shadowy figure outside Tina's window. She thought that it was a guy trying to sneak into the house. She got out of the car and ran over to the side of the house, where Tina's window was located and saw nothing. She looked around the house and didn't see anyone hiding, but her husband had heard the noises. He automatically accused her of being up to no good and sneaking around the house. A huge argument ensued, and I vaguely remember that night. That's when my parents were up and looking out the window. I remember them talking about the commotion down the street, and lights from the police cars lit up the neighborhood. I asked what was going on, and they told me to go back to bed. It was in the morning when I found out that Leland's father had died. Leland's father had taken his own life that night, and I remember feeling so bad for them. Things weren't the same. When I went over to Leland's house, it felt like a huge weight was on my chest. The air was heavy and thick. I felt very uncomfortable in their home. I thought it was the weight of sadness for their loss. I just couldn't explain how awful I felt in their home. The night of the prom came and went. Tina didn't go. She had become more and more withdrawn, and her school life had become non-existent. She refused to attend school and refused to see her friends. Even her closest friends were pushed away. Tina didn't look the same anymore. She used to be full of life, and now she was a shadow of what she used to be. I remember that one evening, Leland had a visit from his uncle. His uncle was checking up on the family, and he was concerned about what was going on. He had mentioned that the house felt sick and that it needed to be blessed. Traditional ceremonies and rituals were new to Leland and his family. They were devout Catholics and did attend Catholic Mass once in a while. I remember Leland's uncle Kenny had told them that they had walked away from their native heritage and that they are no longer in harmony. He had suggested to seek help from a medicine man and that he would need to cleanse the house, especially since someone had died in the house. I was able to go with Leland, his mother, and uncle to go talk to the medicine man. Kenny had lots to say about how we had all walked away from our native heritage and adopted the Western culture. I had asked him about the medicine man and how much he charged for his help. What he told me has stuck with me to this very day. Kenny said that if you had to pay a medicine man for his services, he isn't a medicine man. He is a fraud and only wants your money for his benefits. He said that real medicine man doesn't charge for his services. He is a servant for the community, and the community should give what they can to help him. In the back of the van is seen a case of bottled water, a can of coffee, a sack of potatoes, and a bag of tobacco. I asked Kenny if these items were payment for the medicine man's services, and Kenny replied that it was a small payment to get us started to the path of harmony. The trip to the medicine man's house was about a few hours of dirt roads, and it seemed to take forever. I remember the medicine man's house was a traditional Navajo hogan. The old man was quick to come to the door, and he offered us some cookies and soda. Kenny was talking to the medicine man in Navajo, and I didn't understand one word they said to each other. Leland's mother didn't say much, only spoke briefly in Navajo to the medicine man. Leland and I went out to the van and carried in the groceries. The medicine man's face expressed some joy when he picked up the bag of tobacco. We all left back to Leland's house, and we brought the medicine man back to town with us. When we arrived to Leland's house, the medicine man asked us to carry his toolbox. It was a red toolbox, decorated with paintings of Navajo traditional figures and designs. I remember that he took out a feather and started to pray. He went to the side of the house and asked Kenny to dig a hole against the house, right under Tina's bedroom window. Kenny uncovered a buckskin pouch, and the medicine man asked us to stand back while he used his own tools to open the pouch. When he opened the pouch, it contained 2 more pouches. The first pouch he opened had a black and white picture of Tina. It was wrapped with hair, some types of plant, and a powdery substance. The other pouch had a Polaroid picture of Leland's dad, and that looked like it was covered with dry blood and wrapped around a bone and bound together with more hair. This package also covered in a powdery substance. The medicine man took the items and placed them in his toolbox. He said that he would have to take them back to his hogan, and a ceremony would need to be performed to lift the curse. The medicine man had performed a ceremony inside the house to get rid of the evil that plagued the house. I remembered him going into each room of the house and smudging it with sage smoke and sealing the house with cedar ash. When Kenny left with the medicine man, I remember that making plans for the ceremony. Later that week, Leland and his family had to go to town to buy more groceries for the medicine man, buckskin, a Navajo wedding basket, and a metal ammo box. I was puzzled by the ammo box. Why would he need an ammo box? I was so full of questions, and I wanted to know what was going on, and I wanted to be part of the ceremony. I wanted to see what was being done to lift the curse, so I asked if I could go to the ceremony. I asked what the medicine man found, and Leland's mother told me that the items were buried, were to curse those people, and it was sent by a witch. They didn't know who sent the curse, and it seemed to affect Tina more and more. Since Tina was becoming more and more withdrawn, she never told us that she was having nightmares and seeing shadows in her room. In her dreams, she would see a native man with long hair, and he would be chanting and laughing at times. She said she felt that she should know who this man was in her dream, but she couldn't identify the man. She was being tormented by this dark figure, and she kept it to herself. She never brought it up because of all the drama that had already happened in that household. And she didn't want to add more problems to what was already going on. She kept all this information to herself, and when the medicine man came in to cleanse her room, she finally told her mother what was going on. A couple of days after the cursed medicine pouches were removed, things seemed to get better at the house. Tina's attacks seemed to have settled down, and things started to get back to normal. In a few days, they were going to have the ceremony to lift the curse, and hopefully things were going back to normal. There were chores that needed to be done before the ceremony, such as cutting and gathering firewood. We had gone into the mountains with Kenny and Leland to gather firewood and brought them back to the medicine man's hogan. Kenny was talking about what the medicine man learned about the evil bundles. He said that they were made by a Navajo witch that practiced skinwalking. The person that planted the bundles had had contact with Tina, and she knows who he is. He had planted those bundles to ruin Tina's life, and that he wanted to make sure she suffered by killing her father. The medicine man had also said that the witch had planted a cursed bone into Tina's father, and he was able to manipulate Tina's father's actions. He also mentioned that this could have been avoided if they would have come to him earlier. The day of the ceremony had arrived, and I remember going to the medicine man's hogan and cleaning up his yard. Leland and Kenny and I were chopping wood and bringing the logs into the hogan. When dusk arrived, the ceremony began. I remember that Tina was brought into the hogan, and she sat on the ground. The medicine man was singing and chanting, while at the same time he was making a large sand painting on the dirt floor of the hogan. Kenny was asked to come into the hogan and assist the medicine man. Only Tina, Tina's mother, Kenny, and the medicine man were allowed into the hogan. I was instructed to start a fire outside in the fire pit and make sure it doesn't go out. I heard drums and more singing coming from the hogan, and Kenny came outside with a shovel. He scooped up some wood, charcoal, and ash and took it into the hogan. He came out again with the ammo can and placed that in the fire. He said to make sure that the fire doesn't go out. I started to chop more wood because I didn't know how long the ceremony was going to last. I knew that some ceremonies would go through the entire night. The ammo can had turned black, and the paint bubbled off the ammo can. Kenny came back outside and retrieved the ammo can with his shovel and went back into the hogan. Leland and I continued to keep the fire burning, and we were asked to come into the hogan. The medicine man had told Kenny that Leland and I were going to be blindfolded and wait outside for more instructions. They placed blindfolds on us, and I thought, what did I get myself into? Kenny guided us outside and sat us down on a couple of logs. I heard Kenny add more logs to the fire, and he went back inside the hogan. It wasn't much longer when I heard crying from the hogan. Sounded like Tina was crying, and we heard more drumming and singing from the medicine man. The door opened up, and we heard Kenny talking to Leland's mother, that everything was going to be okay. Leland and I were making small talk, mostly because it was strange and I felt a little scared. I told Leland that I was uncomfortable on what was going on and that I wanted to remove the blindfold. Leland told me to keep it on, and there must be a reason why we were blindfolded. Kenny came over, and he said we were to remain silent and to hold the ammo can. We weren't supposed to open the can, nor were we to put it on the ground. Kenny said someone will be here to pick up the can, and we weren't to look at that person. Just hold the can by the bottom and lift it up once it arrives. Kenny said it was important that we don't look at who was picking up the can, and that not to be afraid. Nothing will happen to us as long as we did what we were told. Kenny had given me the ammo can. It felt heavy, and there was something in the can. It moved around, and the weight shifted from one side to the other. I couldn't imagine as to what was inside the can moving around. I told Leland that there was something moving around in the can. Leland asked to hold the can, and I gave it to him. Leland said that he could feel something moving around inside the can. We wondered what was in the can, and that's when we heard Kenny come out of the hogan. He came over and told us to stay quiet and to listen out for whoever was going to take the can. We asked him how we would know who was going to take the can, and he replied that we would know. Kenny reminded us to stay quiet and listen out as he walked back to the hogan. We listened to the medicines man singing, and it seemed to get more and more quiet, as if the singing was fading away. Then we heard the sounds of heavy footprints walking towards us. Leland sat beside me, and I grabbed Leland's arm. I felt him lift the ammo can in the air. The ammo can started to shift its weight around, and I reached up to help stabilize the can from moving around too much. I heard heavy breathing, and I could feel the warm air of whatever's breath was out there. I wanted to remove the blind to see what was out there, but I was afraid of seeing something I might regret. The breathing sounded like a horse breathing heavy, and its breath was hot like a heater blowing onto your head and shoulders. I could tell this thing was tall and big. That's just how I felt. My heart was racing, and I felt the can move upward, and we let go. The thing had taken the can. I call it a thing because I had that eerie impression that whatever out there wasn't human. We heard it walk away from us, and it got quiet. Then slowly we heard the drumming and singing from the medicine man. We stayed seated with our blindfolds on and waited for next instructions. I asked Leland what he thought, came over, and he said he thought it was a horse. I remember telling him that it wasn't a horse, but something else. Leland said that whatever took the ammo can was cold, like ice cold. I asked him how he knew it was cold, and he said that once it grabbed the can, it brushed against his fingers, and it was icy cold. The drums had finally stopped, and the sun was about to rise from the east. Kenny and the medicine man came out of the hogan, and they said we could remove our blindfolds. We told Kenny what we experienced, and he said that what happened to us was never to be discussed with anyone. He said that a holy being came for the can, and inside the can, the curse manifested into a physical form. The Holy One took the curse back to where it came from. Kenny said that curse was finally lifted, and that things should start to be back to normal. That evening went by very slow, and it seemed to go on forever. When we got back home, Leland's home felt differently. The home felt clean, and it didn't have the negative feeling. I asked Tina about the ceremony, and she said during the ceremony she'd seen the person that placed the curse. The native guy in high school had placed the curse. He was a skinwalker, and he was jealous she didn't accept his offer. She said that she was given a cup with liquid, and she drank it. She became dizzy and nauseous. She said that she blacked out and didn't remember most of the night. Tina's mother had said that Tina had vomited in the ammo can, and Kenny had taken the can outside, and they continued the ceremony. They didn't hear anything else that happened outside. They had no idea that we were visited by something, and it had taken the can. They were amazed when we told them what we experienced outside by the fire. So quoth this raven. Hello, my darlings. I have some more wonderful true Skinwalker stories from Elijah Ninja to share with you. You know it's one of my favorite subjects. Hello, everyone. It's been a long time since I've posted. I've been super busy with work and haven't had much time to write. I thought it was about time that I sit down and tell another one of my Skinwalker stories. This is a story that was told by my uncle's wife. She lives outside of Gallup in a community called Bread Springs. I've told one of her stories in the past, so if you haven't read that story, you should really go back and check it out. In fact, if you haven't read any of my other stories, I would greatly appreciate it if you took the time to read them. One evening, my aunt was home with her siblings. Her parents ran into town to do some errands and wouldn't be back until late. She lived in a pretty rural area, surrounded by a thick forest. Her house was pretty small, and they had few horses. Their horse corral was quite a ways from their house. Each evening the kids would be sent out to tend the horses by giving them hay and filling the water troughs. The hay bales were stacked near the barn. The bales of hay were large, each about 4 feet long, 2 feet high, and 3 feet wide. There was a stack of these large bales, maybe 30 of them. My aunt said that they didn't have a very large barn, and so they'd keep the hay outside and cover it up when it rained. As they were taking hay to the horses and filling the water troughs, my aunt heard a sound. It was a shuffling, scratching noise. The sound was amplified when all of the children stopped to listen. Where they lived, it was so quiet. They could hear the wind softly blowing the trees, but then it would be interrupted by the sound. My aunt's older brother walked around to pinpoint the sound. It was coming from behind the hay. There was a space between the hay and the barn. Not very big at all. The kids all looked and saw something dark wedged between the bales of hay and the wall of the barn. When it moved, its body scraped against the hard surface of the barn. The kids wondered what it was. No one was sure. They figured that whatever it was harmless and went to finish their work. It started to get darker, and the kids thought they would look to see if the thing was still there. It was still wedged against the wall, but this time it wasn't moving. Suddenly, it began to cry out like a cat. Meowing began to come from behind the hay. It sounded strange. It was off. Whatever was behind the hay was too large to be any cat. My aunt said they got very scared because the more they listened to the noise the thing made, the more it sounded like a person trying to mimic a cat. The kids went inside the house and locked the door. By this time it was dark. The kids were sitting in the house, not talking very much. My aunt said that her brother told them to be quiet, and he kept peeking out the window towards the barn. Suddenly, loud noises were heard. Rapid pounding was coming from above, as if someone was running on the roof. My aunt said it had to be a person because the footsteps were so loud. She began crying and screaming as the footsteps ran back and forth. Whatever it was ran back and forth on the roof several minutes. None of the kids were brave enough to investigate. The footsteps finally stopped. It got very quiet, and the kids sat together, shaking with fear. Their attention was drawn back to the door. They heard noises coming from outside. They all huddled together, bracing themselves for the worst. The door opened, and dread was immediately substituted with relief as their parents walked in the door. My aunt and her siblings told her parents what had happened, and they thought that was the end of their horrifying encounter. However, as the days went on, her family would hear the footsteps on their roof at night. Whoever it was would run back and forth, even when her parents were home. She said that her dad would open a window and yell at whoever it was in Navajo. He would tell it to leave his family alone, and then he would begin to pray. My aunt says that eventually the footsteps stopped, but that this was not the last encounter that she would have with skinwalkers. Thank you again for reading. I surely enjoy sitting with my family and hearing these old stories of their encounters. Part 9. Hello everyone. If you're new here, I am a Navajo individual that has been collecting and sharing stories that real people, mostly family, have told me about the Yanalgalochi, Skinwalkers. My apologies for that mispronunciation. Considering that speaking of skinwalkers is taboo, and all stories are oral retelling, I'll do my best to capture these frightening moments as genuinely as possible. This is part 9 of my series. I just heard this gem from and knew I immediately had to post. There's a small community called Church Rock that's a few miles outside of Gallup, New Mexico. Many of the people that live here have had land passed down many generations. This is where our story begins. 2 generations ago. There was a woman that was infatuated with a man in her community. She requested that the man build her a home. In exchange, she would give her daughter to the man to serve as his maid. The woman thought that the man worked on her home. She could woo him in the process. The deal was sealed and the man built the woman a home. The man collected his payment, but instead of having his daughter as a maid, he married her. The mother became enraged with jealousy and ran the newly married couple out of the community. The couple relocated to Rama and started a new life. They had 6 children, 2 of which were twin girls. In Navajo tradition, twins are seen as very powerful. In the mythology of Navajos, the children of the sun were twins, and so they are held in very high regard. This is a story from one of those twin girls. The family began construction on a new home. While they were building the house, the children would play outside as the adults worked. As they were playing, the older twin noticed an animal emerge from the woods. It was a coyote. Usually coyotes are very skittish and avoid humans at any cost. The coyote made its way closer to the girl. A strange smell filled the air, like something dead. The coyote came right up to her. She said that the coyote didn't bite her, but instead put its mouth over her mouth and began to suck the breath from her. It was at this point that she lost consciousness. One of the adults was working on the house when he saw what was happening, and everyone rushed towards the coyote and the girl. The adults yelled and shouted as they ran towards them. The coyote darted back into the woods, and the girl fell to the ground. She was blue. The family worked fast and was able to resuscitate her. The incident resulted in the family going to see a medicine man. He told them it was the grandmother, still harboring jealous feelings towards her own daughter and her family. They had a prayer done, and it was thought to be the end of it. Later, the family received news that the grandmother had died. As the years passed, construction on the home continued, and the twin girls continued to grow. The family had built the first story of their home and moved in. The twin sisters shared a bedroom and slept together on a king-sized bed. It was a hot summer night, and the family kept all of the windows open to keep the rooms cool during the night. One night, the older twin arose to use the restroom. The family kept a small light on in the hallway. She got out of bed and walked down the hallway and did her business. She returned to bed. As she was covering herself, she happened to look up. She froze in horror. There, at an open window, was a coyote, its eyes shining from the hallway light. The window was pretty high, and so the coyote had to have been standing on its rear legs. The girl was frozen with fear and made complete eye contact with the coyote. It was then that she noticed the same smell, the smell of death. She snapped and ran out of the room screaming and crying. She ran to her parents' room and got her father. He ran to the bedroom. half expecting it to be a figment of his daughter's imagination. But the strong smell hit him, and there was the coyote, still standing at the window. The father yelled and ran to get his rifle. The man ran out of his home, but the coyote was gone. The family tried to comfort the little girl, but she sobbed until morning. Again, the family sought out a medicine man. He explained to the family that the hatred of the grandmother had for the family was so strong that the ill intentions that she had for the couple and their family proceeded even after the grandmother's death. When the family was blessed with twins, the grandmother knew the strength it would bring the family, so she wanted to get rid of one of them. The older twin recalls these events vividly and swears that the coyote that attempted to suffocate her and the one at her window were one and the same. Even the scent of death was familiar the second time she encountered the creature. She hasn't seen it since that night and is very grateful for that. This is a story my family told me when I was growing up. We live in a rural community on the Navajo Reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone, while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside they heard noises as if someone moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went up to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncles were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off in the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked towards the light and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. The oldest uncle ran towards the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking its head out to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed them over the gun and placed an ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired towards the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandma chased my aunt inside and my uncles, and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed in one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever it was, running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that dropped about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her, and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who a skinwalker is, say their name, and it will kill them. So quoth this raven. And I hope you've enjoyed these stories, my darlings. I do love a good, true skinwalker story from a Navajo themselves. I know I'm kind of particular about that, but I am in Utah, and I grew up in Utah, and it makes a difference to me anyway. I am so glad you came. And a special thanks to Ermin Case and Darren Da, and my new supporter, Laura Setapenra. If you like this, please hit the little button to let me know. If you didn't, hit the little button to let me know. Leave a comment. I'm always glad to talk with you, my darlings. I'm open to suggestions and criticisms, critiques. If you have not subscribed, please do so and ring the little bell so you know when to come up and see me. And I will talk to you next time, my darlings. Farewell.